We started with the first Digital Media and Learning Conference at the University of California, San Diego, some 7 or 8 years ago, and have gone through a series of cities around the country and have brought it back on campus really as a kind of sustainability model for the conference, and also because UC Irvine is such a fine host. I just want to say a few words of thank you before kicking off the program this morning. A thank you to the University of California, Irvine for hosting us. A thank you to the MacArthur Foundation, without whom we would not have had the first Digital Media and Learning Conference, and certainly would not be doing this one. I'm not sure if Jen Humke and Tara Mitchell are here already from the MacArthur Foundation. They are attending, so they'll be here through the conference. And you know, if you run into them and have a conversation, please do thank them too. The conference is hosted by the University of California Humanities Research Institute, which is really the umbrella organization under which the Digital Media and Learning Hub is cited. I want to thank all the staff of the Institute and the Hub. We'll name them at the end in order to put faces to names and so on. But certainly Claudia Sullivan, who's standing at the back over there, whom I'm sure you all know. Along with the rest of the staff, I want to thank the information technology staff from UCI, who've really gone out of the way in order to facilitate us and in sort of technological enhancement that will get all of you online simultaneously, and the like. So it's a real pleasure to welcome you. I just want to say that before we start with the keynote speaker this morning, we'll need a few more minutes in order to make a special announcement. So if you just bear with us, I think it will be interesting for you, having to do with the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub and other constituencies. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Denon, who is the Vice Chancellor, the Dean of Undergraduate Studies and the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning at UC Irvine, who also runs a Center for Learning and Technology under his auspices. He's trained as a physicist, holds a position in physics here. He's an award-winning teacher. He's taught a MOOC, so he's kind of in the lion's den, you might say. But he's also a noted participant in new television learning teaching programs, including Spider-Man Tech, Batman Tech, Star Wars Tech, and Ancient Aliens. So he's clearly one of us, right? So it's a real pleasure to welcome him. He'll have a few words to say to us. Thanks very much.
I always get a little nervous when Ancient Aliens is mentioned. I'm the friendly skeptic on Ancient Aliens. I'm the one who thinks people. So, no, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to just say a few words at the beginning. As David mentioned, here at UC Irvine, we're very excited. We recently, my office is actually only a year old, the Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning piece. The Dean of Division of Undergraduate Education has been around for a very long time. But a lot of that includes bringing together our Center for Instructional Design, our Center for Engaged Instruction, and our Center for Media Services, which really is a sort of three-center team to help support faculty in all things pedagogical, but particularly also with technology and how it intersects with their teaching. And the other piece that we do is our Teaching and Learning Research Center, because we feel very strongly that what we should do should be evidence-based, based on research, and be actively involved in it. So it's a very exciting time here at Irvine between what we're doing, what's happening in the School of Education, and what's happening across campus. We have a soon-to-be renamed track of lecturers, security of employment, which will be professors of teaching, who really help across and in the disciplines do a lot of this education research in a discipline-based way. So it really, really is an exciting time here. It's very exciting to have this conference be here at this time and looking at going to the forward. We do have this long history here. Even I say this was a recently established office, but it came out of many, many, many years of work that led up to it, both from our university extension, now named Continuing Education, and distance learning through there. That's where I got to do MOOCs, including my most famous one with The Walking Dead. But from there, we've also, early on, the way the university works here is a strong partnership between the faculty through the Senate and the administration and the other units. And I had the pleasure of being chair of our committee of courses when we started our online experiments for undergraduates. We had long had online programs at the graduate level. And to do some of the first fully online courses was a lot of fun. And as you heard from my TV shows, you would not be surprised that my first experiment online was the science of superheroes, just to bring back the Spider-Man tech, the Batman tech, and the science of Superman. And the other piece we kind of like to highlight here going forward, one of the things we're very excited about is our strong track record kind of serving first-generation students and low-income students. You may or may not recall that we were ranked #1 in the New York Times recently for our work in that area, but particularly for first-generation students. We're over half first-generation here at UCI, which we're very proud of, and it's a very sort of impressive feat. And we serve those students, we believe, very well, but we'd like to continue to serve them even better, which is part of what our efforts in sort of the research and pedagogy are about. So it's exciting. I'm glad you're all here, and I'm looking forward to having a great conference. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to David.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to hear from you and hear all the highlights about UC Irvine. The Digital Media and Learning Research Hub has existed here for over a decade. As I said, I direct it, and it's been a great pleasure for the last 8 years to work directly with Mimi Ito, who's been the research director of the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub. She also occupies the MacArthur Chair in Digital Media and Learning, holding faculty positions on the UC Irvine campus in informatics and anthropology, with some relation also to the School of Education. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Mimi to talk a bit about the hub and its transformation going forward.
So it's really great to welcome our DML community here to the UC Irvine campus for the very first time. You've heard from Michael and David what an amazing campus this is, and it's been such a pleasure to collaborate with David. I can't believe I've been here for over 8 years now, working with the fabulous team at UCHRI, as well as our team at the Digital Media and Learning Hub, which is a subset. We're housed within David's institution of UCHRI. So it's really great to both have this opportunity to welcome the extended community here to our very own campus, but also to take this opportunity to share some really exciting updates for connected learning and DML and a growing momentum for this work on campus. So the first part of these new developments that I wanted to share is to share the news that many of you may already know, which is we have a new Dean of Education here who just started his tenure this summer. And we're really excited to welcome Richard Aram to campus. And many of you may know intellectual and a leading scholar in education and equity and higher education reform, but Richard is also a member of our Connected Learning Research Network and has led the Connecting Youth project for over 5 years now, right? Which is a major project of the Digital Media and Learning Initiative. So we're delighted to welcome Richard to our campus.
Thank you. And One of the fun things you get to do as a dean is welcome groups like this on behalf of the School of Education. And so I'd like to share those welcomes with you. The UCI School of Education is a 21st century school of education. Now, all schools of education make that claim, but here's the truth. The UC School of Education was formed in 2012, 4 years ago. That has given us the opportunity to approach work like this, the DML work, digital learning, in ways that are full embrace of the work and the potential of technology to better serve students. And so we have faculty at the School of Education like Mark Warschauer, a leader in this field, Stephanie Reich, who later this month is hosting a conference roughly the same size on child development and technology, Beth Van Ness, Carol Connor, others that are really at the forefront of thinking about digital learning. And that's just the beginning. And so with that opportunity to create a 21st century school of education, again, formed only 4 years ago, and you would never have guessed that, right? Because some of you know the School of Education is already ranked 24 in the national rankings. So the opportunities of creating something from scratch in the beginning and embracing this kind of work is really great. And so the last thing I'd like to say is take off the hat of the School of Education and welcoming how excited I am to be here at UC Irvine and being part of this DML community in my first semester here, because this is my community. And so to be here and join you presenting later today, I'm really grateful for that opportunity. Thank you.
But wait, there's more. So the other news, which some of you may have heard already, is that in the new year, we will be welcoming our keynote speaker today, Constance Steinkuehler, as well as her partner, both professionally and personally, Kurt Squire, to the faculty of UC Irvine in the Department of Informatics. Super exciting. So all of you know that Kurt and Constance are leaders in the games and learning field, and they will provide a big boost to an already really strong focus at UC Irvine on game design, game studies, technology studies, games for learning and social good. And they also will ensure that our very own conference, the DML conference, will have an even stronger focus on games learning, games for social good in coming years. So we're super excited about Kurt and Constance, who have led the Games Learning and Society work for many years, will be bringing that energy to our event and our campus here. And we hope that all of you GLS people out there will be also excited that there will be stronger links between the DML community and the GLS community moving forward. So we're super enthusiastic about building those links that are already strong, but even stronger. So I'm sure that Kurt and Constance will find a welcoming community here among our games faculty, but also our amazing students here. So I'll just put in one more plug for how special UCI is, because we have an amazing student body that represents one of the most well-known and recognized esports gaming communities in the country. UCI has the unique distinction about being one of the first of the major universities to have an esports scholarship, and this was really a student-initiated effort to put student gaming communities on the map as something that is, a force for positive academic achievement and should be recognized by the Academy. So a big shout out to our games community and students here on campus. So, is Kurt here? No. Okay, Kurt's parking. Okay, I think what we'll do is, Yeah, so Constance, come up because I want everybody to be on stage to make a special announcement that we wanted to share, and hopefully Kurt will be joining any minute now. With this amazing group of faculty that we have here, I'm really pleased to announce our plans to establish a new Center for Connected Learning here on campus that will continue the long tradition of DML here at UCI and complemented both by our new colleagues and our existing campus strengths. The Center for Connected Learning will be dedicated to innovative theory and design combined with rigorous empirical research and probably most importantly, guided by the values of equity, access, and diversity. So our focus at the CCL will be about the connected in connected learning. And by connected, we mean the social relationships, in addition to emerging digital and network technologies. We're really about putting the people first in an emerging sort of technical digital network landscape. We're about student interests, about cultural relevance, about supporting communities both in the US and internationally. So this is an early pre-release announcement, and we'll be working in the coming months to forge more connections both on campus but with our broader communities. So we'd love to find ways of connecting with all of you that go even above and beyond the relationships we have here in our conference community and our online community, but we're really excited to be able to share our plans for building and sustaining a community for connected learning here on campus. So, I just wanted to acknowledge everybody, and Kurt, if he was here, would also be standing with us. So. Constance, you're still on, so I'll do the official intro for Constance. So Constance, of course, is a longtime friend of DML and has done so much foundational work on games, literacy, cognition, and is in many ways one of the public faces for games for learning and social good. Constance was a founding fellow of the Games, Learning, and Society group, has been chairing the annual Games, Learning, and Society conference for many years, and was also a senior policy analyst in the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House Executive Office, advising on policy matters about video games and learning. So I can't think of a better keynote speaker to be kicking off our event today. So Constance, I'll give it to you. Let's bring up here.
So in full confession, I have to admit that the DML community, and Mimi, you in particular, and our new Dean of the School of Education, these were all huge draws to bringing us here. As much as I'm selling the beach and the great schools to my children, it's actually the faculty here, and part of that is this community. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you. I'll get it back. Oh. So how many of you are already working in games or gamification or something around that area? Yeah, like a good fourth of you. Right, so it's a little bit like preaching to the choir. I don't have to explain about games. I don't have to explain I'm actually not trying to promote violence or misogyny among populations. I don't have to explain that games are not just one thing and they're not all first-person shooters. That's super exciting. To start off with. It's also super exciting that I'm no longer White House staff, which means I get to go off talking points and say what I really think, which is exactly what I plan on doing. If my slides can come up, because I don't know about you, but
What happened?
I don't know.
Everything was working.
It was so great until I touched it. And yeah, we could just switch to mine. Do you care?
Yeah, go
if
for
you have dongle. I'm just going to bust out my computer. Thank you. Do you have a...
Yeah, I got everything here.
You're awesome. All right. Oh, that's terrible. Let's get rid of my entire to-do list. Okay. There. We're good, guys. We're live. Okay. So today I'm supposed to be talking about what is the intellectual culture of games. Wow, that's huge. So I'm going to parse it with what I know and what I've done, and hopefully try to make some sense and end with sort of where I think we ought to be headed, though I won't even claim to know the future. Though I do have some ideas of where I think it ought to go or what we ought to be caring about, and some of that's already been forecasted in the themes that we've already touched on here. But I'm just going to say, even for those of you who are in games, that we are truly in a golden age of video games, and that's actually not, in my opinion, hyperbole. You know, thanks to two factors, I mean, there's more than two, but the two big ones have been that for the last decade, mobile gaming emerged, and that shifted the market tremendously to this notion that there were these like sort of hardcore gamers and then everybody else, and that first-person shooters or a certain kind of hardcore gaming was highly valued and the rest of it was slop. Now you have a market because the dollars have shown that games can be and do lots of things, including casual mobile games, including a wide plethora of titles, but also including a wide and diverse audience, especially women and people of color. So now, you know, we have an audience that demands a lot of different kinds of titles and consumes them. And we have markets that can support that. And because of that market shift to mobile, games have sort of entered this new amazing space where you're seeing a lot of diversification of the market. The second thing that's sort of happened that I would argue is part of a big reason for this sort of golden age is that, you know, we've now transitioned to a market where there's a really healthy indie ecosystem. And I'm sure many of you, if you aren't making games, you've probably played titles already on various platforms, often PC, but certainly others. Just like Hollywood, where you have, you know, it follows the same trajectory of Hollywood where as games became more and more expensive, their producers became more and more risk adverse because who wants to lose $50 million and a team of 80 people to build your extremely expensive AAA title? So AAA games becomes more and more risk adverse. And while at the same time you had game development and distribution platforms like Steam get more and more accessible. So what you've got now is a thriving indie scene where there still are these great AAA blockbuster games in the same way that there still are great Marvel movies, right? And fantastic Batman movies. I'm the first to line up for that stuff, although Transformers is actually my super favorite. Thank you. Transformers are amazing. Just want to give a shout out to robots that are trucks. Because consumers can get not just these big blockbusters, and two, they can get a ton of other games, right? So rather than just games like Call of Duty, which is great, or Madden, which if my son were here, he would have a lot to say about Madden, or even Pokemon Go, which is a massive, huge hit. But you also now have games that look like Minecraft that are making gazillions of dollars, right? Who hasn't played Minecraft? This is the community that actually, I mean, my gosh, DML is part of the engine that made Minecraft an educational tool. You have games like this War of Mine. Many of us have played this one. How amazing to play a game about war where rather than being the soldier shooting at stuff, you're a civilian trying to survive the effects of soldiers shooting at stuff. Or Never Alone. Never Alone is a beautiful title, an absolute beautiful title that came out of a beautiful collaboration in media. So now, not only sort of golden age of games with indie titles, but you also have serious or games for impact or games for education, whatever jargon you want to put on it. You have those fully integrated into the market. 3 or 4 years ago, I was stomping my feet saying we have to get games out of we have to get educational games out of the pink silo. It's done. I would love to say I did it. I had nothing to do with it except for championing the fact that it's happened. So now, when I show you indie games and other games, you have games that are documentaries, games that are thought pieces, games that are about emotion, right? And it's beautiful. And that's the golden age of games. It's also the case that the market is still booming. Even in the last 8-10 years of our economy in the States, it's booming. So, you know, the latest numbers, $23.5 billion, that's still just about equal to music and Hollywood combined in the States. And then if you look at forecast projections, you see that games are keeping on par with film, even though the video games industry is only 5 years old. Film is over 100 years old. These are incredible. Here's the stat I really love the best, though. If you think that games are big now, just wait, because while half of us that are adults play games, just about everybody who's younger plays games. So you have half of adults playing, but almost all teenagers. So that tells you something about what's on the horizon, what's coming at us right now. And I think it's terrific, not because I don't like film and TV, I actually do, but because games are this incredibly powerful medium for giving first-person experiences. They're the medium that right now, VR is coming though, people, but they're the medium that right now that can take screen time and turn it into activity time. And if you're interested in cognition and learning and doing and thinking and feeling and all this stuff, that gives you potential even above what television and film and art and media can give you, which is exciting to me. There's also now a decade of research, right? When I went into games in 2003, my friends in the learning sciences told me that was too bad for you. You could have had a decent career, right? No, really. Many of you, I look at and so many of you are young, which is awesome. Look at your young faces. I'm not. So when I went into games in 2003, there was very little to no work on this. Jim hadn't put out a book yet. People weren't organizing conferences. People were like, you are crazy to be studying popular culture, which is swill. That's the argument. But then games on top of it, which is like double swill hurrah, right? And history, they were wrong. History showed them wrong. And not because, well, because of the power of the media. And hopefully I can show you why. But now we have a decade of research on the effects on cognition, on learning, on behavior. I put all that stuff together because I tend to think that feeling is part of learning, and cognition isn't just cold cognition, it's hot cognition. And you can't really talk about behavior change and things like health unless you're going to talk about learning and conceptual change, which puts you back in education. So I tend to lump them all together as games that impact. And I think that's a nicely ambiguous category. But that was not where we were at when we were started, right? When I first started, I cut my teeth really looking at online games. And the reason is that I love technology, but I especially love social interaction, and I've always been very interested in what happens when people work together. I mean, the ultimate question to me is like, how do you get a group that didn't know something, didn't know the answer to a question, that after a while figures it out? Like, what does that process look like? And I like all of it, including the messiness, the politics, the feeling, and the cognitive stuff. So I tend to study, I kind of cut my teeth on research that was around online games, massively multiplayer online games. This is, and I tend to also be migratory, meaning that as much as I would love to study the games that I play, I actually study the games that other people play. So I study what mainstream, what gets stereotyped as 14-year-old white male culture, even though it's not, right? But I study that culture. So I study things like Lineage 1, back when it was the global dominant market title, and its sequel, Lineage 2. I can't pass the screen up without saying that character in the middle is mine, and this is a siege that we ran, and we completely clobbered it. I don't get many brag facts on games anymore, so I used to be really good at this. We study games like RuneScape. I looked at the kids who were skipping school to go to the library to play RuneScape, for real. And games like World of Warcraft that still is the global dominant market. It's over 60% of the online market. It has had staying power, and it's just down the street. And a lot of my work, when I first started, there really was no work on learning. There were some studies of online games and virtual worlds and MUDs and MOOs, and that kind of space that were coming from sociology, that were coming from economics, but there really wasn't anything from sort of a cognitive psychology or learning sciences perspective. So, I'm more trained to do sort of mixed method studies, but I realize I don't even know what variables are of interest. I don't know what's important unless I actually dig into what is the culture of this thing in the first place. So I stepped back, And in my early work, I did this very long ethnography looking at what I thought was actually a game title, and it turned out it wasn't a game title, it was a community. And that community moved titles on me, right? So I had to follow the people rather than the technology, which was a huge lesson to begin with. Are there any doctoral students in here? Oh, word. When your advisor gives you permission to do a 2.5-year ethnography for your dissertation, I want you to call me or text me or email me so I can tell you no. The answer at that point is no. But my advisor was Jim G, and he literally said, Constance, go become the world expert on virtual worlds and let me know when you're finished. I was like, okay, thank God there's no one else doing it, so there's just me doing learning on it at the time. So we did this large ethnography that took way too long. It was super hard to get out of. Ethnography was the hardest work I've ever done, bar none, the hardest work I've ever done. And from that, with the help of the MacArthur Foundation and Spencer Foundation and other sort of support, managed to sort of isolate and figure out what were some of the big variables or what really mattered in these spaces. And we kind of narrowed it down to things like collective problem solving and scientific habits of mind and, computational literacy, and sort of got our framing right, and managed to do some more focused empirical studies around those variables, and eventually ran this after-school boys club around it, which I'll explain in a minute. But let me give you an idea of the kind of work that we were doing. This is, early 2000s. So scientific literacy, this is one where we were looking at World of Warcraft, and we were trying to understand what kinds of reasoning was going into playing World of Warcraft, because in the ethnography, I had run into informants in the ethnography that were actually building models in order to figure out what set of class characters and weapons were the ideal ones to take down bosses in the world, right? And when I tried to interrogate it as an educator and said, well, you're doing model-based reasoning, this is science, they were like, oh, no, we're just cheating the game. And I was really puzzled by this. So we decided to do a study to find out, well, how much is this? How frequent is this? Is this just like a couple of precocious kids and maybe their parents who are doing this, or is this typical? And as many of you know now, theory crafting of this sort is very typical. But at that time, very little was written on it. So we pulled a random, we pulled random threads, about 2,000 posts off of World of Warcraft discussion threads, and looked at things like, what is the argument structure like? How much are they doing model-based reasoning? And what kind of epistemology are they demonstrating? By epistemology, I just mean, what is their attitude toward knowledge itself, right? Are they taking this sort of absolutist stance, like there's a big T truth, and it's the one I've got? Or are they being nihilistic and relativistic about it, like who knows, who cares? Or are they actually getting in there and orienting themselves to the world in the way a scientist orients, which is, you have to roll up your sleeves and debate it and argue it and come up with an answer that may be outdated a year from now, but is the best working theory you've got, right? That is the evaluative. So we wanted to look at epistemology as well, because as you might imagine, some of the gamer discourse comes off as kind of, essentialist in certain ways. So this is what we found. And we even looked at things like mathematical modeling. To what extent are kids using math as a form of persuasion in their play spaces? That is so nerdy and amazing. Kids using math as a form of persuasion in their play spaces. And it happens. And if you just look at things like, I'll just give you some highlights from the studies. So even just looking at things like social knowledge construction, after doing the ethnography, I would have said that on a good day, maybe a third of the chatter on forums around games was actually knowledge construction rather than, what I do, which is silly jokes, socializing, other work. And in fact, it's 86%. We looked at argument. Turns out they do a ton of argument. And as you might imagine, they're either agreeing with each other and building on each other's ideas, or they're disagreeing with each other and using counter-argument. More importantly for me, though, you have 28% of this audience using data as evidence. Can you imagine if 28% of America used data as evidence, or even thought that a claim about the world was something you might need evidence to support? Can you imagine where we might be? A very different world. So these are really interesting stats to me. And of course, as I described this like precocious kid doing these models, we're just cheating the game. And it turned out, yeah, there's actually a substantive amount of systems-based reasoning, so more than half is focused on understanding systems and feedback among components of the system. You've got 10% building out articulated models, like models of the system themselves and arguing about it. For example, evaluating each other's models based on how well they predict future behavior. That is really hard to get that's about middle school, high school. That's really hard to get happening in a classroom. You know, I've spent time in classrooms, and there are teachers that are far better than me, but it's really hard to do. It's even hard to do at the undergraduate level. And then, of course, mathematical modeling. You know, when it happens, it's rare, but when it happens, it is bedazzling. It is exceptional. It is mathematical models. I have a degree in mathematics, and I've seen mathematical models. One I often use in slides that, and these are what kids and adults in one single play space are doing and calling fun and paying for, which is exciting. And of course, this last issue, yeah, but are they being sort of essentialists in their talk? I'll Gamergator about it. It turns out that 65% of the talk is evaluative. So no, they're actually orienting toward it as though the phenomenon is knowable, and the way you know something about it is that you work deliberately on figuring out answers and challenging one another's answers. If you compare that to the general population, it's not just hyperbole that I say that, in fact, this would be amazing if we did in public, but Kuhn is probably the classic study of sort of argumentation and scientific reasoning among the general population, and the numbers aren't good, right? An absolutist attitude toward knowledge. Half of America believes that there is a big T truth out there. Half of America, right? And trust me, when people talk about truth, they usually think it's the one they've got. So these numbers are interesting, right? And I mean, of course, there's this chicken-egg problem. Is it that, you know, games attract a certain kind of disposition, or is it that a certain kind of disposition characterizes games? It's probably some of both. But if you think about it in terms of what is the community and the intellectual culture of games, you're starting to see this really interesting picture, especially when you compare it to American schools and ideas like scientific literacy rates. 1 in 5 Americans, these numbers still hold. They've actually gone down a little. And that means, can you read the Tuesday New York Times science edition of a newspaper? Can you understand, you know, equations in an article on stem cells? I'm talking about basic literacy necessary in order to vote, to represent your own view, right? To vote in a way that is autonomous. And of course, then you have data showing that scientific activities, not only the ones that are in classrooms right now, done huge studies of it, and it turns out that many of the science activities we use in schools, typically public schools, K through 12, often not only don't manage to teach science or science literacy, but actually can engender ideas towards science that are the antithesis of science, that are in fact essentialists and not evaluative of what you would need. So here's what happens, right? This is not an uncommon scenario. You have a chemistry teacher in a chemistry class, and you've got the book component and you've got the hands-on component. And every chemistry teacher I know completely nerds out on their hands-on components, the part where they know that you're actually doing science. We all get excited about that. But it turns out by the time it gets translated into a student activity in a classroom, you end up with an activity where the students, while the teacher thinks you're doing a hands-on activity that's inquiry, the students think you're doing an activity where the teacher has an answer and they're supposed to redo the study until they get the answer that the teacher has. Can you imagine if we did research this way, right? I mean, no wonder there's such cynicism about science right now, which is a whole nother topic for discussion, hopefully over a boozy reception or something, because I can't do that sober in the morning. That sounded terrible or something like that. Drinking problem or something. It's the election time. It's very tense for me right now. Where was I going with that? All I'm saying is that, so, you know, you have these activities that end up engendering this idea that you just re-roll your data until it gives you the stereotype, the preconception, the misconception, the hypothesis that you already have, right? That's a hard way to make sense of the world ever. All you're doing is making sense of your own preconceptions. And yet, as despite all of our best effort, including mine in classrooms, a lot of classrooms, when you do a survey nationally, that's the kind of work that you see students doing. Collective problem solving. So lest we think that on these forum threads, for example, lest we think that it's just a couple precocious kids. I said, well, what if it's just Steel Dragon, his dad, and like 2 other super smart kids with like their hyper education, being privileged in more privileged ways? It turns out if you look at the profile of these discussions, they're really amazing. The harder the problem, the longer the discussion, the more people it takes to solve it. So what you find is that the average is about 2 posts to every 1 posters, and you have some outliers, but this is not a world in which you have 3, 5, 10, 30 people solving a problem and the rest sitting around going, cool, right? What you have is collective problem solving. You have people incrementally working together to figure out the answer to something. That's awesome. That's democracy at work. Okay. Literacy, one of the other studies that we did in the ethnography was looking at what is the constellation of literacy practices. At the time that I was doing this work, there was a lot of scare around games replacing reading, right? Name whatever technology you're studying, and I'm sure that you've read that media story about how blank is replacing reading and writing among kids, right? So I wanted to make sure if that's true or to kind of take seriously what are kids doing, and I really took a very conservative notion of literacy here, just print text, because that's sort of the public concern is about print text, encoding and decoding print text. And it turns out even with that very narrow sort of conservative model of literacy, games are all about literacy. You can't get far without a copious amount of reading and writing. But 2 things I'll say. One is that it's a natural part of everyday gameplay. Kids are reading and writing, and they don't even distinguish it as something that's different than playing, which is really interesting to me. And it's very interest-driven. It's fan fiction. It's non-fictional research on the game and sharing details about the game as a way to show your social status. And being able to do that has social status. So this is interesting forms of literacy, right? Well, in a later sort of more empirical work, the non-ethnographic stuff that I did, although ethnographies are empirical, so that word doesn't work, but we started doing some polls of the data around World of Warcraft, other titles, and what you find is that about half of the text that kids are reading is expository text. Literacy people in here? Literacy teachers? There's like, oh good, there's some of you, right? Okay, so this is a big deal because expository text is hard for kids. Narrative is easier, and so you transition in and there's lots of discussion about how to do that. But non-fictional expository text is difficult for kids. So half of this text is expository. The reading level is almost 12th grade. We don't even write newspapers or magazines at that level, unless it's Sports Illustrated, which is like college level reading. And I'm not even being hyperbolic there. But really high reading level, so this requires high school graduation, and 4% of the text is on the academic word list. Now, for the non-literacy nerds in here, the academic word lists are the words that show up on, they show up in textbooks despite what discipline you're in, so they show up in history books and chemistry books. And they're also, that vocabulary list is a strong predictor of your performance on standardized tests. So anyone working with kids or has kids that are studying for standardized tests, like especially college entrance exams, yeah, so the secret that everyone knows but no one says is that basically drill and kill them on vocabulary because that ups your score almost more than anything else. So this vocabulary, it's academic words. That's all it is, it's academic words. So on the academic word list is that academic word. At the bottom you can see some examples, things like insightful, intelligence, restores, required, requirement, focus, compensation. Language that is used in academic settings, and it's a strong predictor of your performance on these high-stakes tests, right? Well, 4% of the text that kids are using in games is academic words. And that's a pretty good stat, right? If it's too high, then there's too much unknown vocabulary in the text for kids to get through it. If it's too low, it's not really doing much. So 4% is an interesting sort of percent to have in game text, right? That's completely about play. All right, so you have literacy, yay, and it turns out to have this profile. Well, great. Well, if that's the case, then why aren't boys specifically doing better in schools? Now, let me back up and explain. So girls and boys play. Both adults, girls and boys, we're near parity in terms of males and females playing both at the adult level and at the kid level. Girls and boys play different games, but oh, girls play, right? The games I study are still predominantly boys. So, and companies don't like to really give you stats, but the last stat I saw that I trusted was about 18% female on the games that I study, and the rest all boys. So, if I'm sitting here doing studies that shows that that gameplay of the kind of genre I study is actually engaged with these constellations of literacy, that they have these really great profiles as literacy interventions, then wouldn't you kind of expect boys to do better in school? It also helped that I had 2 boys while I was doing this work, so I started thinking, literacy, I should read up on gender, but this time rather than gender and technology and girls, what about boys? And it turns out boys on average in the States read 2 grades below level. But games are this sort of traditional boys' play space. Games like World of Warcraft, Lineage, lots of boys flock to these spaces. And Jenkins and others have made this argument that for boys in today's contemporary culture of no more latchkey kid, no more unsupervised playtime with their friends, boys have turned towards games as a place for them to actually engage in the same stuff that we did in my generation, but we did it on the streets playing kick the can because our parents weren't watching. All right, so only 65% of boys graduate high school. They underperform and opt out of literacy-related coursework, and they consistently score lower on the NAEP. Again, 2 grades below level. When I wrote this study, I'll show you up and send it to, I won't say what journal. The senior editor wrote me back and said, well, I think it's kind of hyperbolic because you called it a crisis, and the boys' literacy has been 2 grades below level for more than 2 decades, so it's hardly a crisis. And I was like, yeah, as the mom of 2 sons, it's totally a crisis. Like, All right, so in order to figure out what gives, why isn't it making a difference in schools, right? We decided to run this after-school program. Crystal, Martin, Amanda, some of my former graduate students who are now off on their fabulous careers, helped do some of this work. So we ran this after-school club for a year, all for boys, in order to figure out what is happening specifically in literacy, other areas too, but specifically literacy around boys in schools and games. That's what it looked like. Chose a maximum variation sample. So we had 25. We studied them for a year. We studied them ethnographically for a year. Remember when I said that's the hardest work I've ever done? This was really hard work. So we took 25 kids, and we weren't sure what might matter, so we went for a maximum variation, meaning that half were from an urban environment, half were from rural. Half were struggling in school, and half of them were doing fine in school, were reading at level. There was only one criteria to get in, and that you had to be, basically you loved games and you hated school. And that really didn't narrow it at all. So, right, so there's that. So in our group, half of them read at level and half of them read below level, all the way up to like 5 grades below level. The idea was that we were going to engage them in World of Warcraft and then watch them over a year and watch what they did in school, watch what they did with their peer groups, watch what they did with games, figure out what's going on, right? Are they doing literacy? Like, is it a natural part of gameplay the way that we've surmised? And if it is it at all connected to school? Is there anything happening in schools? All right, so that was the idea. We did this for an entire year. And what was so interesting here was that they were reading text that was well into college level, and we know because we tested it. We would actually like sample from the stuff that they were using and find out what they were doing and run stats on it. They were reading text that was at college level, and yet every single participant read with comprehension. And we know because we watched what they did with the text after they read it, right? Every single student in our group, despite the fact that half of them were struggling readers, read with comprehension. So what gives? Well, so we decided to do a study on it. So we thought we would school-based reading, right? So first what we did is we gave everyone a reading, the QRI, we gave them a reading test to make sure that their diagnosed reading level was still accurate and was precise. Then we gave them 2 things to read. We gave them a school-based text straight out of their textbooks. We gave them a game-based text straight out of their game world, the game resources they were using. And we had them read each of them, right? And then we looked to see what's different. Are they performing the same? Are they doing as well in comprehension, et cetera, et cetera? Now, we controlled the level of difficulty so that it matched their reading level. Does that make sense? We're like, okay, if you're an 8th grade reading level, then I'm going to pull 8th grade reading text from a textbook, 8th grade reading text from a game site. I'm going to have you read them both and see what happens. Yay, right? All right. Well, that was the idea. And they were counterbalanced, all of that stuff. So here's materials. That's what a game text looked like. That's what a, equivalent. I know, they're really not that different, right? But here's what we found. There was no difference. When we looked at all the metrics we were interested in, no difference, just flatline. And we thought, this is weird. How can it be flatline when they're assessed as reading so poorly by tests and in school, but I have them reading, college-level text of difficulty and doing just fine. So we thought about it again. We thought, well, we kind of did an artificial deflation of difficulty in certain ways. And we also chose for them what the game text would be, right? That's kind of different than reading a text around a game that you are reading on your own. So we re-rolled the study, and we had them come back, and we said, okay, let's redo this. But this time, give me 3 topics that you want to read more about to do something in the game. Give me 3 topics. So they gave us 3 topics. And we had rules. So we decided, okay, it has to be at least 12th grade level reading difficulty. It has to be at least 2 grades harder than their reading level. It has to have 4% academic vocabulary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But they gave us topics, and we went out and found hard text on those topics. And then we just saw what happens when we do this, right? And here's what happens. So when participants chose topic, you see that, so the average level of text was college, 13th grade. That's about 4.5 grades on average across the group, 4.5 grades harder than their diagnosed reading level. You with me? I know, okay. So when you do that, it turns out that students were reading up to 8 grades above their diagnosed level, right? More interestingly, if you separate out the struggling readers and the non-struggling readers, there's no significant differences at all in the performance between struggling and non-struggling readers. So take a look at this. You see that you have struggling readers are reading 5.3 grades above their head. They're reading harder text, right? Bigger differential than non-struggling readers reading 4.3 grades above their head. And there is statistically no difference whatsoever in their performance, right? So you now have this sort of reading scenario in which struggling readers no longer look at all like struggling readers. So why, right? What's happening? Well, okay, so we went back and we went through all the stats. We have them read aloud. We're looking at performances of their reading. We're doing a running record, which means that you're making annotations while they read of all of the various mistakes that they're making. Well, there's this one stat called the SelfCorrection rate. SelfCorrection rates are not considered an error because a good reader, A, chooses challenging material, which means B, it's going to have something in it that they don't quite get the very first read through. And C, when they encounter it, they figure it out on the fly. They fix their comprehension, right? I like the word subtle. That's the word that has a weird B in it for me. I don't know, I'm from Missouri, so I can't find the B in subtle. But it might just be a regional dialect thing. So when I see that word, I always hiccup for a minute, and then I know what it is and I move on, right? Okay, so that's a self-correction. It doesn't count as an error rate because it's what good readers do. So on the first study, when you look at game text versus school text, right, but they don't get to choose the topic, 17% self-correction rate, it's fine. It doesn't stand out as anything big. But then when you go to the second study and you look at that same rate, it more than doubles. So this is significant to like 0.001. So what's happening here is that you see persistence in the face of challenges. Right? This is really important. This is the thing that makes a struggling reader look like a non-struggling reader. It's not that they encounter fewer challenges in the text. It's that when they encounter them, they care enough to actually figure out from context what that word or that phrase means and repair it on the fly. Right? Okay, so I have to do the no duh, because once we saw the results, we were like, duh, right? Because we did these like little interviews that were so cheesy now that I think about it. Like we did these little interviews that were like, do you like reading? And we had participants say things like, I don't know, no. I mean, I guess it depends on what I'm reading, right? It's like, do you like television? Do you like food? I mean, yeah, but not all food, right? So it matters what you're reading. It really matters what you're reading. So my point being that you start to see that it's interest. It's not games. Now, games, I would argue, I mean, it's my go-to medium, but I would argue that games are this amazing architecture for engagement, right? Game designers have to design for interest. They have to design for engagement. It's why we talk about addiction to games and we don't talk about addiction to books, right? Although I may have an addiction to book. But what you're starting to see is the role of interest in learning itself, right? So you find that games are kind of this Trojan horse, or in my view, why I'm interested is that games become kind of this Trojan horse for what I would consider progressive pedagogy, that is interest-driven pedagogy, where the goal of getting it done is the first driving wheel, not left out of the equation or not, explained in a big reveal at the end of the year in a standardized test. Kids don't even know why they're doing what they're doing. But actually, interest and that kind of engagement is the very engine that makes it go. It's the driving wheel in the system, right? That means that this is, of course, the wrong frame. Because this frame, I cannot make this metaphor no matter how much I browbeat people. I just can't even say it out loud. I'm not going to even say it. But this metaphor treats interest, well, I would even go, it treats joy, interest, beauty, let's just roll them all in there, as though they are this, this grotesque sort of patronizing thing that you do for students on top of the real content, which is absolutely ridiculous, right? I mean, math is the real content. And math, the gorgeousness of math is in the power of math and of mathematizing your world and being persuasive because you can crunch it out and show that you are correct, right? That is the sticky part of math. So it's not that interest in games and gamification, all this stuff is this lathering of sort of just condescension on top of the real content. It is the content, right? And if you don't start with that, then what are you doing? Like if you're... Jim used to talk about, Jim G used to talk about the Snow Report. Catherine Snow, a brilliant literacy scholar. She's at Harvard. I have great admiration for her. They put out a report about reading that concluded that phonics was the way to go for reading instruction. Now, if you talk to any person in literacy, any teacher, they will tell you phonics have to do whole reading too. So this war between phonics and whole reading, there's a war, people. If you did not know, there is a cold-blooded war, trust me. But the truth for any teacher is that they're not even interested in this war. They use them both, and they use them when it's strategically necessary, right? But Jim's whole point about the Snow Report, he used to say, what's interesting is that in this report, they talk about how they can increase phonemic awareness. They can increase reading performance in a matter of, months. But of course, the problem is that it doesn't necessarily last. So, with third grade slump, fourth grade slump. But the second problem is even more is that when you ask kids, when you use this form of instruction, and only that form of instruction, when you ask them, do you like to read? They're like, no. Would you read some more? No. Do you consider yourself a reader? No. So you create a form of instruction that teaches phonemic awareness, but actually produces non-readers, right? And that's broken. That's really deeply broken. Okay, that's a long thing on that. And this is also, by the way, the wrong frame. Right. So the Ford Foundation, National Television Network, I think it was called, the Ford Foundation. I'm really fascinated with, because I did work in policy and continue to work on that level too, I've become really fascinated with what are the levers and dials you can use to fix an ecosystem or to sort of, to get an innovation economy moving. I'm very fascinated by that. And go to history. So anyone aware of like the massive investment in educational technology that was supposed to, thank you for nodding. I'm like, yeah, you guys are so young. Here's 2 minutes on nerdy history of technology and education. So they put a lot of money. People are really excited about TV. Every time there's a new technology, we think it's going to save education. And then we think it's going to kill children and make them horrible, desperate, terrible people. And then we find out that it really just amplifies, right? Roy P. had it right. It really just amplifies whatever you put it on. But Ford Foundation put a lot of money into educational television. And the idea, I mean, it's such a great idea, right? I grew up in a area in Missouri. So the idea was that you could actually have content that, you might be in New York getting all sorts of exposure to advanced calc, but in my little school in Missouri, I would not. But through television, I could, right? I would actually get a chance to get content I otherwise. And you can see they poured lots of money into it, by the way. It actually eventually sort of morphed into Corporation for Public Broadcasting, actually, which did an incredible job and continues to do an incredible job. But you can see in the beginning stages when it was like this educational TV network, what's wrong, right? It's a classroom sitting in desks with a teacher watching television of a classroom sitting in desks with a teacher. Whoa. I mean, you have this great example of rather than understanding the medium for what the medium can do and using what it can do, exploiting what it can do really well, instead you have this model of sort of doing the same thing you've always done, but now doing it with a new tool, and really nothing changes at all, right? It's just the same pedagogy. It's just now, I guess, on TV, and students can, and that's the wrong frame. And we do run this risk sometimes, right? In games, it's written oftentimes as sort of like what it requires to get into a classroom means it has to see the needs of teachers and principals now. And I get that, right? I totally get that. But I also don't know that I want games to necessarily, I don't know that like games getting in classrooms is a goal I set for my life. Like if games get in classrooms, I'm gonna die happy. I don't think that's a huge goal for me, right? If games like enrich life, that's a huge goal for me. If you enrich life through any means, that's a huge goal for me. But I mean to say that these sort of pressures to get stuff done in a very sort of pedestrian way can end up with nothing but reifying the system. And I'm not the first to point out, you either, actually it's Freire people, either teach kids to do nothing but reproduce the system and play, or you teach them to change it. And you choose which one you're going to do. And this is just teaching kids to reproduce the system that's currently we have. And I don't know that system is working. I know it's not working, and it's not working for everybody. So one of the reasons why we're excited about DML, I just want to say, is that these issues around games, they're not different, right? I see a lot of people going, yeah. I mean, I'm not saying anything that's new. These are some of the same tensions and issues, these sort of frictions and barriers that are around other digital media as well. The question then becomes, if they're a Trojan horse for what I would say, games have this potential for being a Trojan horse for interest-driven learning, right? And forgive me, I don't mean this in a political way. I just mean like progressive pedagogy, literally, as in pedagogy that we used to know how to do 20 years ago, and now only private schools that you pay a lot of money for know how to do, right? Interest-driven education that's knowledge building, that creates all of that. So if games, to me, are this Trojan horse for interest-driven learning, then you have to ask the question, what are games also a Trojan horse for that might not be so nice, right? And I will say that there are concerns. There are concerns. I have concerns. And now I will say as a citizen what I think are some of the concerns. I think that games, like other digital media, are starting to get rolled into the regime of assessment that's in schools because all of our digital devices give off such incredible data. And all that data exhaust gives you, there's this promise of formative assessment. There's the promise that you could finally, for once, evaluate a kid on the problem solving that they do rather than the performance they do at the end of learning, right? This is hot. That's beautiful. The problem is that we are at a place where it's getting co-opted and taken up in the same assessment systems that are in public schooling. And I think it's really problematic. And I think that it will be us as a community that make decisions about, if Roy P. is right, and I think he is, that technology is an amplifier, then I think we have to make conscious decisions about, in this case, what is it going to amplify? What is it going to be a Trojan horse for? Is it going to be a Trojan horse for more sort of panopticon, weird Orwellian assessment of kids at every moment? Can you imagine? I mean, that's what we're talking about. I have conversations 4 years ago with companies doing things like, well, we're looking at how long a kid spends on a page, on a Kindle, and using that to infer confusion and understanding. And I was like, so is spending time on a paragraph confusion? Or is spending time on a paragraph understanding? How would you know? Well, we do algorithms of that. And I'm like, I don't know if that's going to work for you. But I do know this. I do know that, in my opinion, education is suffering an incredible problem right now of not addressing the issue of equity, and that we have managed to create a system that looks a lot like a class-based system and a lot like a racially divided class-based system. And so if you start seeing those patterns and start seeing like kind of the pipeline going to prisons for men of color, young men of color I work with, digital technologies caught up in an assessment system that is moment by moment by moment by moment assessment of what kids are doing as another way to reify that system. Now, I am not, oh, thank you. I'm like, please don't get mad at me for saying this, because I'm totally optimistic. I really am optimistic. But I do think that, like, we're going to have to engage. We can't just sit around and be like, well, we have great data algorithms, and I have a great data architecture, and I'm sure that it's just going to be used for formative assessment. That's not how this works. And I know that firsthand because I see policymakers, and I see companies, and I see Common Core, and I see all of it happening, and there's a lot of good momentum. But I think that every single person in this room, if you're not concerned about equity, then I'm not sure you're in education. And that's, if you want to hate me for that, that's okay. I'll totally take it. But I don't really know that you're in education then. And second, I don't know that digital technologies right now are doing more than amplifying the problem. And it ought to be doing something like fixing the problem. It won't single-handedly fix the problem, by the way. But people will, and this community is one of them. And one reason that games need to be in a broader context of a conversation about digital media is that these issues are common to all digital media, not just games, right? Issues of interest and engagement, interest in how it's getting taken up in classrooms and outside of classrooms. There are two other things I would say that, unfortunately, games have become a Trojan horse for. A second one, so first is becoming part of assessment regimes. A second one would be that games don't work without great teachers, right? You can do really stupid crap on games, and you can do really stupid crap with textbooks. You can do really marvelous stuff with games. You can do really marvelous stuff with textbooks, but without teachers, really none of this really works. So I think that the ways in which our technology communities have accidentally sometimes taken up the rhetoric that deprofessionalizes teachers, I think is really problematic. Because in the end of the day, I got into technology because I saw it as a way to connect people, and this is connected learning. And it's that connected, see, people learn from each other, and technology either amplifies it and enables it, or it gets in the way. And I think that teachers and experts and mentors of all different ilk are part of that conversation. And so I think we ought to be pushing back on some of the anti-teacher and deprofessionalized rhetoric of teachers. I think that's a second issue that, if we're not careful, technology can be a Trojan horse for without us knowing. And the third one, I'm not sure I can formulate very well, except for to say that I do worry that we're ending up with an anti-public schooling rhetoric that is a problem. And I feel particularly morally culpable for this, because when I wanted to study games and technology, I didn't want to study classrooms because nothing is happening in classrooms, right? It was just like, gonna study, I don't know, it's like hiring the tabernacle choir to hum, right? You're like, oh, there's nothing happening. So I studied play spaces, right? I studied play spaces regardless of age and background and accessibility. But K through 12 public schooling is about democracy, and it's about the right to a public education. And I think that inadvertently, by doing work always outside of the classroom, it was really convenient for me because I felt like I got to study this really high-end stuff and sort of imagine what it would look like elsewhere. But somehow that momentum and that excitement and that optimism is in some ways sort of bolstered this sort of anti-public schooling rhetoric, which I think is really, I personally am against. I think it's bad. So I guess I would say that's the other third Trojan horse. I'll still do work outside of schools, for sure. But I have got to figure out ways, and so do we as a community, of making that work pay off in public, democratized schooling, or it's not doing its job. Well, and I'll stop there now that I've got my politics on. I am very optimistic, however. I'm very optimistic. I mean, at least in my life right now, I feel like we're moving into a new chapter where games for impact are no longer off in a pink silo, where we have like this sort of trajectory where we have a solid decade, and the hype curve is over for games, which is actually really helpful because now we can get to the real business of making games pay off in the way that technology should and could pay off for much broader systems, public schooling, teachers, etc. So I'm really, really optimistic. I'm ready to get started. So I'm going to maybe stop for questions if we have time. I went really long. Sorry. Thank you, first off. Thank you. Dun, 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 dun. Can we maybe questions for a few minutes? Anyone?
You said that we need to use games in public. We've done some research to work on games. What do you think that looks like?
Well, I don't think it, so does everyone hear the question? So what does games in public education look like? I think it comes in multiple directions. I don't think it's necessarily games in classrooms, though that certainly is a form, right? I think that right now the effort to finally really wire all of our classrooms is a step one baseline. I mean, that was the Clinton era, and we're still working on that problem. What? That's crazy. I think that, so facilities are a problem. I would say that the thing that games have to bring are probably not just games in classrooms, but also thinking about principles of design and thinking about teachers as designers. So if you look at the Quest to Learn program in New York, I'm sure everyone's familiar with that, Institute of Play. Like, what is amazing about that is that, look, my kids, I don't live in New York, my kids aren't going to get to go to that school. But what is really amazing is that if you've met their teachers and seen their professional development, they are hardcore designers. And they are professionalized as designers. And they are privileged as designers. And that's what master teachers are, right? So the thing, I mean, there's lots of things they did well, but I think it's a great example of how it is that games and sort of the design of games can infuse not just like gamification of classrooms. Let me put up a leaderboard and that's going to make my classroom better. Oh, no, 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 right? But instead, positioning teachers as designers and thinking about ways in which curricula, you know what the big ideas are first. You design from the very beginning for understanding. So you design so students know what they're doing and why they're doing it from the beginning. And using principles for game design throughout in that way. And I think those will be the enduring legacy of games. Though in the meantime, I really hope we get our national infrastructure up to where, you know, where you don't have a computer lab in a school that's totally unsupported, that's down the hall, that one guy typically maintains in his off time, and no one else uses. We're getting there, but it's going to be a long haul. Yeah.
If you want to make change, I'm a doctoral student, so if you want to make change, but you don't want to do the 2.5-year ethnography, what would be a better route to take?
Ooh, that is so big. I mean, I don't know. I mean, what's the right route to take? I think we have a lot of different pathways looking at it here, right? I mean, I heard a lot of the themes about the DML community, not just this year, but for several years now, and I think we're all working on this problem. I mean, I think serious inquiry into classrooms is one of them. I think that we still have to be working outside of classrooms, but I think we have got to start to leverage and use our power of persuasion to talk about what students and teachers have a right to. They have a right to it. And I think we have got to stop acting like we don't have an equity problem here. We have a race and equity problem. I don't know how we have that conversation. If we don't have that conversation, if we're not going to do it here, then God help us, because no one's going to do it for us. I mean, schooling's just rolling along the way it's rolling along, and we're supposed to be innovators for change. So I guess I would just say, if you could take 10% of your effort and put it toward issues of equity, that would be good. Then I would consider you part of education. We should be fixing it. I know that doesn't help much. It doesn't help much, but other questions?
Yeah, so more of a meta question about, as a bridge builder between kind of the GLS communities and the DML community, what are, I guess, some things that you would observe, I guess, that we should be appreciating about the differences in maybe culture or orientation or questions we're asking or how we interact with each other that we can kind of learn from both sides of the aisle, if there are two sides of the aisle?
Well, and there's other GLS people here. It's not like there's two different tribes and we never cross. We're pretty much all cross-pollinating for years now, right? That's a great question, though. So what do we know from GLS that would be helpful in DML? And what do we know from DML that would be helpful in GLS? I see them as all part of sort of the same community and culture, two different events. And the truth is that this is going to be an all-hands-on-deck effort. And I fear what's going to happen in January. So I sort of feel like we better circle the wagons, and we better get our act together and get talking points and organize, because if we're not going to community organize for students out there, I don't know what we're going to do. I'm really looking forward to this event. I will say GLS, you guys have a beach, so I'm pretty sure that you win. We don't have that. We have a lake. Hey, we could sit by the lake. But I think, in all seriousness, things that work from GLS that I have personally learned a lot from, that are going to drive what we do next, are that if you want to have a field, you have to build it yourself. That includes opportunities for publication and sharing of knowledge and sharing of design. And we aren't so good at the design part yet, and we ought to fix that. And I don't know what the right fix is. But by that I mean we need to be able to share the things that we're building and critique them. And there have been attempts, but nothing has passed the tipping point. I think that conferences like these tend to be more about networking than they are about learning content, because the learned content will publish in great prestigious journals and proceedings, and you can read it later. All of you are is that you come to an event of a speaker or someone so you can see who else is in that room, so you can see who your colleagues are, so that you can start to community organize, right? So these are really about networking. That's why we have long breaks between sessions, because it's that work that we're all here to do. Otherwise, we'd be doing it all digitally. We know how to do it. That's a lesson learned. I will say, too, actually it was Connie Yao, of all people, who, when I was working in DC, I was at a meeting at E3 for games, and it was a small meeting about games for learning, and she and I were put at the same table, and I was like, oh, I feel like it's so inefficient. Like I feel like I should be getting all this stuff done, because when you have when you have the power of the White House that you can work from, you can do amplification. You have a lot of meetings, but you can get people together and get things moving in a way you can't before. And I was just sort of bemoaning the fact that I felt like I wasn't doing enough or getting enough done. I was like, we should be able to just roll out blanket initiatives. And I was like, but instead, I feel sort of like this, like I'm going door to door, community by community. I am literally saying, hey, you company ought to work with that researcher, with these two teachers to do this amazing idea. And how about you guys fund it? Like I was literally feeling like it was blow by blow. And Connie Yao, who I'm sure many people here know, she's fierce, by the way. She's not here. This is streaming. I can say it anyway. People fear Connie Yao. She gets stuff done, right? So she walks in, she's like, we are doing this. And people are just like, I will do this because Connie Yao told me to do it. It's amazing. She does not radically trying to change things. But the piece of advice she gave me, she was like, no, pretty much that's how you get work done. You're not going to get work done by issuing a memo, right? Or having another committee set up. You're going to get work done in the most laborious fashion that you're doing it, which is you're going to get person A to talk to person C because there's this other thing they need to be working on and doing, and they need to know this other person, and then it's going to be community grassroots organizing. And I was both tremendously relieved because I respect her and to be told I'm not actually just sucking at my job. But then I was also kind of disheartened and scared because I thought, I don't have a lot of time here, right? I'm not immortal. So how are we going to get enough done so that public schooling and democracy look different when my kids are in high school than when they are now, right? And I don't know, but it's going to take a lot of organizing to do it. And I think about that a lot. I think about the fact that we need to be connecting people, not just students and teachers, but we need to be connecting our communities and dealing with policy. You know, one more parting word of wisdom. I will say that I still don't know really what people mean by the word policy. People use it in a lot of weird ways. I had a title of senior policy analyst, and I could never figure out what I was analyzing and that if I was doing anything close to analysis. It doesn't look like research. It looks like cheerleading and connecting. But I will say that I did learn that it actually does not take 50,000 people to change something. It doesn't take 5,000 either. It doesn't even sometimes take 550 people writing a handwritten letter to a state politician can change things. And so, you know, you don't get the luxury of being cynical or apathetic, because once you see that, you start to realize that politics is something that's moving right now, and people could do it. We could all right now decide there's this one thing we want to do and go after it and have it changed quickly. Not in the time of academic research, like 20 years later, 10 years later, I can say games aren't going to kill babies. Well, that was horrible. But actually in the time of real people, it can happen in 6 months, not 60 years. And so I think that apathy, you can no longer be apathetic about it, which is great. Thank you for having me.
Wow. We are so lucky to have Constance joining us. So just a few housekeeping items. I wanted to encourage everybody to come to the afternoon and evening events. We're going to have our usual Ignite talks, which are obviously always a big highlight. And we have a new format for our reception, which is a place for us to showcase our tech innovators and for you to interact directly with them and demo their stuff. So I think it'll be a fun new kind of format, and we will also have drinks at the evening reception. So just another draw for all of you to stick around. And just in the spirit of, you know, what Constance was saying about building our momentum here on campus and encouraging you all to come back to enjoy our beaches here. We're happy to announce that the Learning Conference will also be held at UC Irvine the 1st of October next year. So I hope you all put that on your calendars. Okay, enjoy your day.
We're